Aaron stood in front of me with his hands in his pockets like he was talking about work, not about our marriage. His voice was even and light, without a single edge of emotion. "I can't change when you're this strong," he said. "You make me feel like I'll never be enough." I looked straight at him. No reaction, no pushback. I just noted what had come out of his mouth, the way you notice a piece of glass fall to the floor. Sharp, clear, and not yours to claim. He had just placed his lack of maturity on my shoulders as if it were something I'd dropped. I thought that was the end of it. But a few days later, sitting with a mutual friend, I heard her say that Aaron had told her, "I can't fix anything because Mira's too independent. She does everything fast, handles everything herself, so there's no room for me." If the first line was a knife, this one was him twisting it while insisting I was the one holding it. A man using his wife's strength as the excuse for why he refuses to grow. A smoother way of saying, "I don't want to change, and that's your fault." What's interesting is that it didn't break me. It didn't shake me. I just felt clear. If you want to know why, I'll tell you from the beginning. My name is Mira. I'm quiet, reserved, and when I do something, I finish it. I don't go around calling myself strong, but people tend to see it in me before I even notice it myself. I pick things up because I can, not because I want to carry them forever. And Aaron? He's not awful. But he dodges responsibility so smoothly that anyone watching from the outside would think he's just tired. He slips into leaning on others without realizing he's doing it. And the worst part, he's very good at making himself the one who's under pressure. As if someone, usually me, pushed him into that role. Before the blame started, our life looked pretty steady from the outside. We lacked nothing. Everything seemed so put together that people probably thought we were the typical grown-up suburban couple. 2 stable jobs, weekend cleaning, the occasional dinner out to break the routine. But inside, the split of responsibility wasn't balanced at all. I handled most things, not because I liked it, but because if I waited for him, everything stopped. And I can't stand the feeling of standing still. I started noticing all the small signs I used to overlook. The things he said he'd do but forgot. The times he pushed decisions back to me with, "You're better at it." The conversations where he kept repeating that he never gets a chance to prove anything because I do everything too fast, too solid. But the truth is, I moved fast because if I waited for him, everything would fall apart. And he used that to say I was the reason he couldn't move forward. One time, when I asked him to take care of a small task around the house, Aaron sighed like I was asking for something huge. "You always know what to do," he said, "and me, I'm just not as strong as you." I stayed quiet, but something in me shifted. Not because of what he said, because he was testing a new escape route, blaming me with words that sounded gentle. The truth is, I don't need someone to be like me. I just need someone who doesn't use me to avoid himself. At that point, I still thought Aaron was just speaking out of stress. But when I heard my friend repeat the story he'd told behind my back, the story where I was the reason he couldn't change, I knew this wasn't a slip. This was a habit. A pattern. A way of sidestepping responsibility wrapped in "I'm weaker, so you should understand." I did understand, but in a different way. My strength wasn't the reason he stayed stuck. It was the excuse, the exit, the shadow he hid behind so he didn't have to take another step. For the first time, I realized he wasn't afraid of change. He was afraid of having to change without me cushioning every fall. I stood there, in front of Aaron, hearing him say my strength made him feel not enough. But deep inside, in a very quiet place, I saw it clearly. My strength didn't make him weaker. It only hid the truth that he had chosen not to grow. After I realized my strength had become his escape hatch, nothing between us shifted overnight. There were no fights, no drawn-out silences. I just started noticing every tiny piece I used to ignore because I thought it'll work out anyway. But when you look again with different eyes, those little things stop being little. They form a pattern. The first thing happened just 2 days later. I reminded Aaron he needed to call the repair company since he'd said he'd handle it himself. He glanced at me so lightly anyone else would think he was kidding. "You're better at it," he said. "Just call them so it's done faster." A simple line, but it landed right on the truth I had just uncovered. He wasn't weak. He was choosing the easy road. And the easy road was me. I didn't respond. I just walked away, but I logged it, not to blame him, just to see how deep this pattern went. The next day, he forgot the important documents he needed to submit early. We were sitting in the car, right in front of the office. He let out a sigh so long you'd think he was carrying a whole week on his back. "If you weren't so hard," he said, "I'd try more." He said it like it was an obvious truth, and all I needed to do was nod. There was no anger in his voice, just that little push, the kind people miss unless they're standing far enough away. I turned to him. "Hard how?" I asked, calm. He looked off. "I'm just saying, you know?" I did know. I knew in a clear, cold way. He wasn't lacking ability. He lacked initiative because I had filled every space where he'd have to take a step on his own. He was used to standing behind me, using my pace as the reason he never moved. Then on another evening, while I was reorganizing the kitchen cabinet, an acquaintance texted me. "Aaron said you're forcing him to grow up too fast." Sounds intense. I read the message and felt nothing except a thin, quiet stillness. Forcing him to grow up. Another way of saying, I won't grow unless you grow for me. I just replied, "Yeah, leave it." And I put it exactly where it belonged, another piece of the larger picture. The unmasking came the next week, when he took on something we had already agreed he would do, preparing the paperwork for his new job. Not a big thing, not a hard thing. He just needed to sit down for one evening and finish it. But on the day it was due, he hadn't done anything. I asked gently, "Did you do it?" Aaron looked up from his phone, oddly calm. "You do it better, so I figured, you should just do it." In that moment, I wasn't angry. I just went quiet. It felt like he had handed me the answer I no longer needed to search for. I stepped closer to the table and looked at him. "You're not giving me the task," I said softly, just loud enough. "You're giving me the responsibility you don't want to hold." He froze for a second, his eyes blinking slowly. No reaction, no defense. He simply hadn't expected that. He was used to me taking it without a word. I walked away before he could say anything, not to avoid a fight, but because a fight would have been pointless. The truth was already spoken. In the days after, I watched more. Not looking for mistakes. Just watching. One night out with a group of friends, the conversation shifted to work and pressure, and someone asked Aaron if he had a strong personality. He laughed, a laugh that sounded like a confession wrapped in something soft. "Mira's too strong. She does everything so fast. I can't keep up," he said. There was no ownership in his voice, just the shadow he cast. "I'm strong, so he can't be." I heard him, but I didn't look at him. He wasn't talking about his actions, what he didn't do, what he kept pushing away. He was talking about me. And I saw one thing clearly. He wasn't just using me to avoid growing up. He was using the best parts of me, my strength, my decisiveness, my ability to stay steady, as his excuse for standing still. He turned me into the reason he didn't have to step up. A perfect piece of logic. If I was strong, then he was naturally weak. If I was fast, then he was slow because there was no other option. If I knew what I needed, then he didn't need to know. And the coldest part wasn't that he said it in front of other people. It was that he believed it in his own mind. It gave him a story that was easy to live inside. He was pushed to the back, instead of choosing to stay back. At the end of the night, when we headed home, I walked a few steps ahead, listening to his footsteps behind me. He didn't say anything, as if there was nothing worth saying. But inside me, another piece slid into place. An important one. I wasn't the reason he wouldn't change. I was just the nicest excuse he could find. An excuse shaped like a wife who could handle herself, stand upright, and solve things before they became problems. And he was so used to it. Used to the idea that my strength was some kind of attack on his weakness, instead of seeing that he was the one choosing not to grow. I went home, hung my jacket on the hook, and looked around the familiar room. Everything was as quiet as always, but inside me, a line had been drawn. Not a line between him and me, a line between what I used to accept and what I would no longer carry. Aaron didn't lean on me just to feel lighter. He leaned on me so he wouldn't have to move. And for the first time, I felt cold at that point. A clear, steady kind of cold. Not sadness. He had used the best parts of me to explain the worst parts of him. After those days of quiet watching, everything seemed slower. But it was really moving toward a breaking point neither of us had seen coming. Aaron kept acting the same, as if blaming me had become a safe foundation he'd stood on long enough to believe it was solid ground, and I was just waiting to see how he'd react when that ground finally shifted. The moment that went too far came on a Saturday afternoon. We had just finished lunch and were about to meet Liam, a mutual friend. For the meeting, Aaron was the one who had promised to prepare an important set of information the group needed. He'd told me clearly that he wanted to handle it himself this time, as a way to prove to himself that he could. I didn't step in. I left that space for him, even though I knew he rarely took a full step unless someone stood behind him. We got to the restaurant a few minutes before Liam. Aaron opened his bag, rummaged through it, then stopped. I looked over. The envelope he needed wasn't there. He checked his wallet, then the glove compartment, then came back in, his face pale in that way people get when they're trying to stay composed. "I forgot," he whispered. I didn't say a word. Right then, Liam walked up to the table. After a few greetings, Aaron started explaining why his part wasn't ready. I thought he'd say, "I forgot," or "I mixed up the timing." Something simple and accountable. But he looked straight at Liam and said, "Actually, it's because of Mira. She's so good at everything that I'm not confident doing things anymore." His words hit the table like something heavy I hadn't braced for. Not because they hurt. They didn't. They were just too familiar. But for the first time, someone else heard them straight from him. I turned to look at Aaron, not to check if he misspoke, but to mark the moment he chose to place his responsibility on me again, right in front of someone else. Liam went silent. He looked at me as if waiting for a reaction, but I had nothing to give. I'd passed that emotional point a long time ago. I set my glass down and took a slow breath. "You don't need confidence," I said, my voice steady, barely louder than the room itself. "You need responsibility, and I'm not the reason you avoid it." The whole table went quiet. Liam didn't say a word. Aaron froze for a few seconds like someone whose secret had just been read aloud. What I said wasn't blame. It was the bare truth, something he couldn't redirect. He couldn't turn it into, "You're too strong." He couldn't turn me into the shield. Aaron opened his mouth, but the words snagged. I didn't hold eye contact long, just long enough for him to know I saw him clearly. Long enough for him to know he couldn't put anything on my shoulders this time. Liam was the one who spoke first. "Aaron, I've heard you complain about this for a while now," he said slowly, hesitating like someone trying to choose the right words. "You always say Mira makes you feel pressured. But honestly, maybe you're using that to avoid your part." Liam's voice wasn't sharp. It was just an observation. But it made Aaron blink fast, like someone caught off guard. I looked back at Aaron, calm enough that I could tell the calm itself bothered him more than any anger would have. "You've been using me," I said quietly, "to protect your image." No one said anything after that. Liam looked down at the table, trying not to turn the moment into a public reckoning. Aaron lowered his head, his shoulders sinking, not from shame, but because he had no way out. He was used to turning his lack of movement into the result of my personality. This time, that story didn't work anymore. We left the restaurant and walked toward the parking lot. The sun was hitting the sidewalk at an angle, pulling our shadows long, though the distance between us felt strangely shorter. Aaron didn't say a word on the way home. He sat beside me like he was in a courtroom where he was the only one who could hear the judge's gavel. When we pulled into the driveway, I unbuckled first. He stayed in his seat. Eventually he let out a breath, long and tired, like someone peeling off a mask he'd worn too long. "I didn't mean to," he said quietly. I didn't answer, not because I was angry, but because I knew he believed that in his own way. He truly thought everything he said was circumstance, not choice. I walked into the house first, opened the door, and let him come in on his own. In my mind, every piece from the past few weeks flowed into one point. I didn't need to leave the marriage. I never wanted that. But I saw clearly. I just needed to step out of the role he'd placed me in. The role of the person who carried everything for him. The person turned into a mirror for what he lacked. I stood in the living room where the afternoon light stretched across the wall. I understood that what had just happened wasn't simply Aaron being exposed in front of someone else. It was the moment he lost the story he'd been leaning on to make life feel lighter. The story where he was pressured by his wife. I didn't need to win this confrontation. I didn't need him to admit anything right away. I only needed one thing: to see clearly that my path was pulling away from the role I used to play. In that moment, I felt a new boundary. Not a boundary of separation, a boundary of power. The power to not be used as the reason someone else refuses to move. The truth was simple in a cold, steady way. I didn't need to leave him to change the balance between us. I just needed to step out of the place he was used to leaning on. And when I stepped out of that role, quietly, without any noise, I knew the next part of the story wouldn't be about me carrying him anymore. It would be of how he'd have to stand on his own for the first time, without me as his wall to lean against. After the meeting with Liam, something in me shifted. It wasn't disappointment or exhaustion. It was the realization that I couldn't keep standing in the place he was used to leaning on. I didn't need to leave us, but I did need to leave the role that kept him still. I started with the smallest things. I stopped reminding him of his schedule, his meetings, his follow-ups, the deadlines I used to carefully put in my phone to help him remember. I let him handle all of it. Not as punishment, but because they were his to manage. When he forgot something, I didn't rush in to patch it. When he left something unfinished, I didn't quietly complete it. When someone asked about something related to him, I didn't explain on his behalf. I didn't do any of this out of anger. I just let go of a role that didn't belong to me anymore. In the first few days, Aaron reacted exactly how I expected. He was irritated, as if me not helping was some unnecessary inconvenience. "You can see I'm busy," he said when I declined to check his schedule for him. I just answered, "I know," and did nothing more. I could see the faint irritation in his eyes, the kind that comes from someone who's used to having a backstage crew and is now forced to step onto the stage alone. But I didn't say anything more. That role wasn't mine anymore. Then came the confusion. Aaron started to realize this wasn't a momentary lapse. This was change. He forgot an important appointment. When the partner called him directly, I could hear the uncertainty in his voice from the home office. The first time in months he couldn't pull me in to smooth things over. I sat in the kitchen drinking water, quietly listening to him handle it himself. His confusion didn't make me happy, but it showed me something clearly. He was finally living inside the responsibilities he'd always had, only now there was no one covering for him. A few days later, the worry set in. Aaron started checking his phone more often, asking me questions he never used to ask. "Do you think I forgot something?" How should I reply? I just answered, "You decide." That sentence made him fall silent, like I dropped him into unfamiliar territory with no map. But that territory was his all along. The empty space started to grow, the space I used to fill so tightly there wasn't a crack left. When he forgot something, he dealt with the consequences himself, reminders from coworkers, the disappointed look from his manager. When he dodged responsibility, people brought the complaint straight to him, not through me, not wrapped in the nice explanations I used to give. When he vented, people didn't nod along like before. They looked at him longer, asked why he didn't handle it himself. Maybe because I was no longer playing the quiet person behind him that everyone had silently relied on. Strangely, I didn't feel lighter in a liberated way. I just felt right. Like everything had finally returned to where it belonged. I was still living with him, still eating dinner with him, still sharing this home. But I was no longer the excuse he leaned on. No longer the person he blamed when he stumbled over his own unwillingness to grow. No longer the strong one he needed so he could stay small without feeling embarrassed. One evening, when we were sitting on the couch with the soft yellow light falling across the table, Aaron stayed quiet for a long time. Then he said, "You've been different lately." I kept my eyes on the TV screen and answered gently, "I just stopped doing your part." He turned to look at me, and for a moment, there was no defensiveness in his eyes. It looked like recognition, small but unmistakable. As if he was seeing for the first time that my strength had never been the problem. It had only hidden the truth that he wasn't using his own. In the weeks that followed, I kept doing what I knew I had to do, standing in my own role, not the role he handed me. I didn't fix the mistakes he left behind. I didn't clear the path. I didn't shield him. I showed up as a wife, not as the crutch he'd learned to lean on for years. And I started to feel a kind of freedom, Not from leaving the marriage, but from leaving the structure that had drained me. It wasn't loud. It was in the way I breathed. In the way I no longer had to chase after things that were never mine to carry. I watched Aaron slowly face the emptiness of his own space, and it made me see something important. I didn't need to break the relationship to get my power back. I just needed to take back the strength that had been used in the wrong place. One afternoon, after he forgot to send a document and a coworker called him out, he came home, sat down at the kitchen table, and said quietly, "I thought you'd help." I answered as gently as a breeze, "You know I won't do your part anymore." He looked down at his hands, and I saw the moment a man realizes the power he once had. The power to shift responsibility, to hide behind someone else, was disappearing. In the way he looked at me, there was no anger. There was truth. The truth that I hadn't gone anywhere, but he had lost the privilege he'd grown used to. He realized, maybe for the first time in his life, I didn't need to leave him for him to lose his power. I just needed to stop letting him borrow mine. And when my part returned to me, his part, responsibility, growth, facing himself, finally had nowhere left to hide. In the weeks after I stepped out of my old role, the rhythm of our life changed in a visible way. Not because of big conversations or new promises, but because Aaron had to face the empty space I used to fill for him. He had to make decisions on his own, fix his own mistakes, handle situations where before all he had to do was glance at me and I'd be there, ready to catch whatever he dropped. I watched him work through things. Sometimes clumsy, sometimes so unsure, I thought he might slip back into the old pattern, look for a way to hand the responsibility back to me. But he didn't. He called people back, apologized, organized his schedule, took feedback he used to dodge by saying I was too strong. He didn't have that story anymore. With the excuse named Mira gone, he finally had to look at his own part. One day he sat at the dining table, laptop open, going through tasks he'd let pile up. I walked past and heard him mumble to himself, "Not forgetting this time." The sentence wasn't directed at me, and that made me realize something. He was starting to stand on his own legs. Slowly, but for real. Then on a very quiet evening, he walked into the living room while I was folding clothes. He stood there for a moment, like he was trying to choose the right words. "I thought you'd left," he said. There was no weight of accusation in it. It was soft, the kind of softness that comes from someone realizing they've misjudged something for a long time. Bookmark. I looked up at him. "No," I said gently. "I just stepped out of the place you put me in." He went still, as if that sentence opened a door he'd never noticed before. He sat down next to me, but not too close, like he was giving me space he used to assume I didn't need. "I thought you gave up," he said. "I didn't," I replied. "I just gave your part back to you." I didn't say more, I didn't need to. That moment was the turning point of the whole story. Not because I threatened to leave, not because he was afraid of losing me, but because he understood that my stepping out of the old role wasn't a fracture. It was a chance for both of us to stop repeating the old pattern. After that night, his change became clearer. Not in a dramatic way, but in a way that showed he had no detours left. He started doing the small things he used to avoid, calling the repair company himself, updating people on his work, saying, "I'll handle it," without sliding it over to me. And what told me his change was real was this. He wasn't doing it because I demanded it, not because I was angry, not because my silence scared him. He did it because there was no one left to blame. And in that emptiness, he realized he had to face himself. One time, after finishing a task he'd relied on me to do for years, he simply said, "I should have been doing this a long time ago." I nodded lightly. No praise, no encouragement. I didn't need to push him anymore. This kind of growth had to be his own. The surprising thing was how light I felt. Not because I'd left the marriage, but because I'd stepped out of a burden that was never mine in the first place. I no longer had to guess his mood every time he stumbled. I no longer had to explain on his behalf. I no longer had to carry the invisible responsibilities he placed on my shoulders, as if they were naturally mine. I lived in my own home, but for the first time in a long while, I wasn't living inside his story about me. I lived in a truer version of us, where each person stands on their own ground. One late evening, he looked at me while I was locking the back door. His eyes weren't searching for an escape anymore. They were searching for direction. "I know you're not going anywhere," he said. I turned the key and looked right at him. "I'm not. But for the first time, you have to step." That sentence wasn't a declaration. It was simply the truth, something both of us needed to hear out loud. Aaron stood there, silent, not offended, not shrinking, just listening, as if he understood that what I said wasn't an order. It was a beginning. In the days that followed, everything moved quietly, as if we'd stepped into a new chapter that didn't need noise to mark its beginning. He took more initiative. He complained less. When he made a mistake, he fixed it. When someone asked something, he answered. And I didn't return to the old role. I didn't help to make it faster. I didn't step in so it wouldn't be a hassle. I didn't become the strong one he hid behind so he could stay small without feeling ashamed. The change didn't make our relationship perfect. It just made it real. No dramatic breakup, no tearful promises, just two people standing where they're supposed to stand. One learning how to move, the other learning not to move in his place. And the feeling that came from all of it was a kind of maturity that was cold, slow, but beautiful in the most practical way. I stepped forward, not away from him, but away from the version of myself he had leaned on to avoid growing up. It was a freedom I didn't need to leave the house to find. It started right here, between the two of us, when one person stopped giving what was never theirs to give, and the other finally had to take responsibility for what was always his. Some relationships don't need to be left. They just need each person to stand in their own place. When we stop carrying what isn't ours, the person beside us is forced to grow. And sometimes the strongest change doesn't come from walking away, but from no longer being the place where someone hides from themselves. That's the end of the story. Thank you for listening all the way through.